We're just going to give it a minute for a few more people to arrive, and then we will kick off. Okay, I think if we get started, and then if more people arrive, we can let them in as they join. So hello everyone, and welcome to this bookmarks talk. This session is being coordinated by the Open Access Books Network. My name is Lucy Barnes, and I am editor and outreach coordinator at Open Book Publishers, which is an academic-led, not-for-profit open access press. And I also work on the COPIM project, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Just a bit of housekeeping. The session's being recorded, so if you would prefer not to be in the recording, then please turn your video off. And I don't know if you've all been to one of these sessions before, but they're quite conversational. So if you would like to ask a question, feel free to drop it into the chat, or you could turn your camera or your mic on and just ask the question. So today I am delighted to be speaking to JANNEKE ADEMA, to MARCELL MARS and Tobias Steiner about their work on the experimental open access book publishing project that sits within the COPIM project. And the report Books Contain Multitudes, Exploring Experimental Publishing, which was published in February of this year. Before I introduce the speakers more fully, just to say that the COPIM project is the community-led open publication infrastructures for monographs project. And it's an international partnership of researchers, universities, librarians, open access book publishers, and infrastructure providers. It's funded by Research England and Arcadia Fund. And it's a 3-year project, which is currently at around the halfway point, which is building community-owned open systems and infrastructures that will strengthen, expand, and diversify open access book publishing. Just submitting a couple more people. There we go. So to introduce the speakers, JANNEKE ADEMA is a cultural and media theorist working in the fields of book publishing and digital culture. She's an assistant professor in digital media at the Centre for Post-Digital Cultures at Coventry University. And in her research, she explores the future of scholarly communications and experimental forms of knowledge production. She also explores these issues in practice by supporting a variety of scholar-led, not-for-profit publishing projects, which include the Radical Open Access Collective, Open Humanities Press, the Scholar-led Consortium, and Post Office Press, and then, of course, also the COPIM project. And her monograph, Living Books, Experiments in the Post-Humanities, will be published by MIT Press in the summer of this year. MARCELL MARS is a researcher, programmer, and artist working in the fields of internet regulation, intellectual property, and open source software. He's one of the founders of the Multimedia Institute in Croatia. His research, Ruling Class Studies, began at the Jan van Eyck Academy in 2011, examined state-of-the-art digital innovation, adaptation, and intelligence created by corporations such as Google, Amazon, Facebook, and eBay. And in 2012, Marcel initiated Memory of the World to develop socio-technical infrastructure and invigorate the historical argument for universal access to knowledge. And Marcel is also a co-initiator of the Pirate Care project. And Tobias Steiner has studied in Hamburg and in London and holds an MA in television studies from Birkbeck University of London. Between 2013 and 2019, he worked as a research fellow in the fields of open source, open science, and open education at the University of Hamburg. And since February of last year, he's been the project manager for the COPIM project. He says on his website that he considers himself a traveler between the worlds of advocacy for openness in its many facets, mixed with a little bit of project management and a distinct dash of cultural and media studies, which sounds like quite a cocktail. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to talk today about COPIM's experimental open access book work. So I wanted to start, I suppose, with a bit of a general question for all of you, just to say a bit about what the Experimental Books Project within COPIM is aiming to achieve.
think I can start with that one. So first of all, I want to thank you, Lucy and Agatha, for inviting us here to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing. So yeah, this is a specific work package within the COPIM project, and it's called Experimental Publishing and Reuse. And so what we're focusing on is basically ways to more closely align existing software tools and technologies, as well as workflows and infrastructures that support experimental publishing with the workflows of open access book publishers. So the way that we're doing this is we're creating a few pilot cases or pilot studies, or actually projects, I think is a better word, because they're actually book projects that we're doing together with academics or academic communities and with publishers. And these form the kind of examples or kind of prototypes for other publishers to adapt and kind of take on. In addition to that, we're also looking at how non-experimental open access books can be reused by the scholarly community. So we're really interested in things such as annotation and collaborative writing around existing publications. So it's basically focused on how we can build communities around open access content and how we can stimulate its uptake further. And finally, I think what we're focusing on, and this report is actually the basis of that, is that we want to create some kind of online resource that supports and promotes the publication of experimental open access books. And so the way that we envision it is that this will be the kind of place where you can see examples of experimental open access books, where you can see the kind of tools, workflows, infrastructure, software that can support you if you want to do something more experimental, et cetera, et cetera. And we're very much hoping to basically build this together with the community itself, so the publishing community and the research community. So yeah, and I think the reports, I think it's been sent around the blog post that we wrote around it previously. For people who don't know, the way that we've set it up basically is that it's a report in 3 parts, and the first part looks at situating experimental books in the context of academic research and kind of mapping them. And what we then do in the second part of the report is we create a kind of a typology, which is always a kind of a temporary stabilization, I would say, and we're hoping to kind of update that during the project too. And the third part then looks at a review of existing resources and a roadmap for this online resource that we're creating, as well as kind of looking at 2 key practices that we've started to elaborate more, which are collaborative writing and annotation. And for further versions of the report, we kind of hope to add to this. So yeah, one of my colleagues maybe want to say a bit more too about what we've been doing.
Toby, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure, why not? But also, yeah, just to repeat the invitation that Lucy voiced earlier for the audience also to just ask questions if anything comes up that you might want to pick up on. Feel free to raise questions and any follow-ups right away. That's no problem at all. But yeah, I think overall the outline from Janneke has framed it quite nicely. I think from my personal perspective, it's what draws me to the work package 6 or the experimental publishing work package is really this combination of working on the theoretical underpinnings, but also on the practicalities of what it means to work with the academic long form, so to speak, because yeah, that's I think something that is still quite underrepresented in the research that is out there, especially in the field of open science, for example, where you have still a lack of representation of humanities and social sciences research and practices. And with COPIM overall, but also with the experimental publishing work package, I think what we are trying to shed light on here is to focus on what can actually happen in the space of the long form argument. And to just really explore and survey in a way the multitudes that exist in the book sphere, so to speak. And yeah, maybe bit of a philosophical underpinning of sorts.
Yeah, sure. Marcel, can you speak to that? What particularly do you think that the work package is trying to achieve in terms of OA books and experimental publishing? I think you're on mute, Marcel.
We were just commenting on that before, yeah. So yeah, I think that most of that was already covered by my colleagues. And just in short, my background of my research comes from like quite a lot of hands-on. And what I like in this project is that it takes care of also running things, running infrastructures, thinking about technology autonomy and things like that on both sides, not only running it technically, but also in which way technology and the communities and in which way the social and technical kind of meets. And I think that that's kind of the horizon. And then on the way there, there are many steps now.
Yeah, and I'm interested to hear a bit more about, obviously COPIM is building different types of infrastructure to enable open access book publishing to kind of proliferate and to sustain itself. So if you think of an infrastructure, I suppose you might think of systematizing ways of doing things, or laying down a kind of a base or a use case which may be thought of as typical in certain ways. So how does experimental publishing fit in with that, and how does this work package work with other bits of COPIM to start thinking about how experimental work can be fostered by infrastructure? And that question is to whoever wants to jump in.
Maybe I'll go with that. That's a great question, actually, because yeah, it's very multifaceted, I would say. I think overall what we see in COPIM with the different stakeholders and different teams involved is that all of us, I think, share this kind of bibliophilia, this real love for the book. I think there's something that also came out in one of the workshops that we've recently been holding around the governance aspects of COPIM as a whole. And I think in the experimental publishing workshop or publishing package, that really yeah, comes to light in a way, because I think at the core of working with books isn't just to produce the standard PDF, for example, or just the generalized output that we see out there, but also, yeah, to explore, to invent, to experiment with everything that's out there, the possibilities that the digital as a whole really offers to, yeah, the working with the academic long form and the book. And this is the kind of epitome, or this epitomizes, I think, the work that we are doing in the experimental publishing work package. So really this love for the book that we put into practice there, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think if I could add to that, I think what we also really want to do, which lines up with what the larger COPIM project do, is that we're trying to be as community-led as possible. So we're trying to, I think we're trying, first of all, to set up these kind of relationships between open access tool providers, or open source tool providers and infrastructure providers and presses, because I think there are kind of connections missing there, but also again with author communities to make to make these different groups aware of what is out there and what can be used, and kind of building those communities of expertise around the tools, around the books, etc., etc. And we've been doing that in different ways. So we've been doing a few workshops. So we've done a workshop together with platform developers and presses last year. This year we've done 3 workshops now with groups of academics around reuse and how we can kind of stimulate reuse of both text and data. And we've also been collaborating with other projects that are looking at experimental publishing, and we really see the kind of work we do as something that we do in collaboration with others in that sense. So we've been working with the Next Generation Library Publishing Project, and together with CORE, they've released the SCOMCAT, the Scholarly Communication Technology Catalog, which we had a preview access to before it was released, and that was really important also for the work that we've been doing in the report. And we've been collaborating a lot with the Opera's P project, who's done research on the future of scholarly writing in the social sciences and the humanities. So we've been trying to kind of establish these connections and set them up more widely, but we're also aware that we still need to connect to other communities too. And if anybody is interested in the work that we're doing, please be in touch. So if you think that we need to be in touch with certain people, please just drop us an email, because we're keen, especially when we're going to develop that online to get as many people involved with that as we go forward. So yeah.
Cesar, would you mind just muting? There seems to be a bit of background noise just coming from you. If that would be great, thank you. Marcel, can you say anything about how this work kind of fits into COPIM more broadly?
Yeah, I think that in that sense, I think that experimental part here is in nice kind of like a attention with the infrastructure. So if we do a lot of things out of like being more convenient, no? So then we rely on them, and then we end up in like the political kind of situation where we don't like them, because we just start to rely on like corporate whatever the infrastructure. So in that sense here, I think that it's also the kind of brevity of like letting yourself get into more mess in that sense, and see how far you can go with that, and not only in terms of like playful experiment with like something very particular like a book, but at the same time also like playing how to be inside or like in the process of the infrastructures which are maybe not that stable and not convenient, like the ones which you would expect from, I don't know, like the giants like Google. And that's what I really like of how these kind of like different layers gets together. And I think that in 3 years, a lot of experience and a lot of insights will come from that kind of play.
Mm-hmm. And we were wondering, obviously the monograph has a central role in many disciplines and is important for a thriving and diverse scholarly communication system, but it also faces various challenges which are often caused by a lack of funding. I suppose particularly this issue is a sharp one when it comes to open access. So within this context, what triggered your interest to look at experimentation and reuse specifically? Why is this important within this broader context?
I think we originally wrote this work package description also out of response to this report that I did for YISC together with Graham Stone a few years ago now. And we interviewed a lot of not-for-profit academic lab presses. And what came out of that is that even though, and I found this quite interesting, that in my experience, it is exactly those smaller not-for-profit presses that have done the bulk of the experimentation or have done the most interesting experiments around book publishing. But they're also in a way the most hesitant, because there is a fear there of, one, not having enough funding to do this kind of work, and two, not having the skills or labor to kind of engage with it. And I think we wanted to respond to that in a way by highlighting, first of all, the amount of tools that are already available at the moment to support it, and then specifically the amount of open source tools that can be adapted and that can be adapted to publishing workflows, and helping publishers to kind of see that, right? And also kind of by bringing this together in these kind of toolkits, etc., by getting away from the expertise, or you need to be an expert in doing a lot of these experiments, which isn't true. A lot of experimentation around different forms of peer review or annotation or collaborative writing really don't need some kind of really elaborate tools set up or whatever. So kind of showcasing that. And I think at the same time, what we wanted to highlight is that it is actually not only around funding. Of course, funding is important. Funding is important to support small publishers to do this kind of work and to kind of replicate this kind of work. But I think what we wanted to kind of line up more with is also how within open source communities, it is this idea of the care for what you're building together, right? And the care for the experimental books. And I think this is why they've been so successful within more scholar-led publishing environments, because there is this kind of care for the book in which people actually are interested in maintaining something and setting something up and sharing it with others, instead of what happens a lot with, well, as I would say in general, not only in commercial publishing, but there is a specific grant to do some kind of project, and then once that's done and the software is not open source, it just gets abandoned, right? And that's it, and it's not further taken on. So I think there's this idea that yes, some kind of upkeep and financial support is needed to maintain these kind of infrastructures, but we also need support for these kind of smaller scholar-led presses that have actually been doing most of the maintaining around them.
Mm-hmm.
Time to tether.
I would like to add that for me, the interest is also like, so like a lot of, especially people like competent in like software development and understanding truly kind of technical aspects, that they would tend to kind of converge into like one universal computational digital object, no? So that every other object then tends to be analyzed through these lenses. So then there is no book, there is no film, there is like, it's kind of like everything becomes one in a sense. And I think that it's very good to get to play with the role and the definitions and establishment of the iconic objects, especially which comes from the kind of pre-digital era. And I think that dealing with them and in that sense, like intervening there is usually a very good way how to intervene into the whole system around that. So in that sense, if we want to like intervene into the systems of metrics and other things like losing some of the borders of the iconic and well-established objects will probably help also to do a little bit more of other struggles. So in that sense, it's very politically important to pick, I would say, like the one which is well established and see how far you can go with that and how you can build your argument. Not only these kind of, I don't know, like the outcomes as such, but also like how do you then try to articulate what you were doing and what's there, you know? Because obviously it shouldn't be something which is obvious for everyone, because then most probably it was not really like experiment at all then.
Mm-hmm. And just to kind of, oh, sorry, Toby, did you have something you wanted to add there?
No, generally fully agreeing with what Janneke and Marcel said. Just to add maybe that I think on the level of funding especially, there's currently, or over the last couple of years already, lots of talk about fostering bibliodiversity. And I think experimentation is exactly in the heart of what a bibliodiverse ecosystem should foster. So I think it just makes perfect sense to look at that and invest in that in a broader sense. And I'm really glad that we can do that with COPIM.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess just to kind of to bring these conversations to something concrete, to a kind of example of the sorts of things that you're talking about. Can you share some examples of something that you've worked on, one of these projects that you're developing, which maybe perhaps pulls out some of the themes that we've been talking about, or is particularly interesting for some reason? Is there one that you might describe for us, or even show us, I guess?
Maybe I can start with this one. So as I already mentioned, my research is based on a lot of practical work. I'm a software developer, I do programming, and I run some computer infrastructures. And I think that I kind of get to know some of the workflows, which kind of like raises from the needs of other kind of fields of collaborative work, like software development. And then being inside of digital networks, they also kind of, it is about exactly that kind of how we build all of that and then how we coordinate. And that's what we do when we do like open source and sharing and all of that. So in that sense, I think it's a kind of strange mixture of surprised when these kind of workflows get outside of the software development, let's say, but also feeling like, yes, it finally happened. And I think that it happens also when they are in some way mature, not necessarily just as a tool, but also as an ecosystem, as a production of, as kind of translation to the rest, or like inside of that world and then to the rest of the world. So what I like, for example, what we were like doing quite some kind of deep analysis is like the whole history of pads. Like Etherpad is most probably like the most important. How we got there, how that was like an experimental project. Actually, it was like a spin-off of a company. We just wanted to show their like the demo, no? And then Google found that, and then they bought them for the Google Wave, the whole like engineering team. And then we got the Etherpad as some kind of spin-off of that as an open source. And then we could see like the whole number of pads which would go in different directions. I like very much a CryptPad, which took care that you can run it on a server, but then the one who's running the server will never see what you are doing there. So in that sense, the cryptography is very important part of that. Then CodeMD, or before it was called HackerMD, would be much more kind of serving the needs for rather bigger kind of project with some feature of the project management. I don't know, like I think that there is also like a whole cluster of projects which are interesting because they are addressing the new, for quite some time now, but the new, let's say, medium, the new place where everything should end up, and that's our web browser. No? So there is a lot of revisiting of all different kind of technologies which were built before the browser, and now they're entering the browser. So there is like a very interesting field of typesetting and how to basically do the whole like desktop publishing inside of the browser, so that while you are doing things like Etherpad, while you're like doing collaborative writing and things like that, you basically get a lot, like you're allowed to print all of that out in a PDF, paginated PDF. Coco Foundation is doing quite a good job there. They do a number of like, it's a modular design, so you can use like different components. I think that there is also still like a great kind of cluster of projects which are more following the paradigm which Wikipedia started. So it's like a wiki, open wiki, things like that. So and then like some would go more into like how to take care of the metadata, how to kind of fit into the publishing kind of workflows and things like that. So yeah, there is I hope that I brought what you were asking, a couple of concrete examples. But what I would also like, what I think what is for us very kind of interesting is how to basically pick up some of these tools. Some of these tools are not even tools for some people, but more like components in order to like bring them together, and then it becomes a tool. So how to bring the different tools and then build something. And eventually, if that experiment was successful, we can also expect that will become, that workflow will probably become authoring tool in its own. So some authoring tools which are existing will probably recognize that and then try to bring that as a feature. So that's kind of how we did this and how we are trying to do our research and development.
Mm-hmm. Toby or Janneke, have you got anything to add to that answer from Marcel?
Yeah, I think this what Marcel raised there is this diachronic approach or perspective on how publishing has evolved over the last couple of years, or yeah, actually decades now, with the web itself being quite old now already. I think it's really interesting, and I think we're now at a point where we see this kind of a wide range of matured open source platforms that are ready to use, which hasn't always been the case. Like I think those of us who have been engaged in, like, for example, digital humanities or adjacent fields of research and practice, and have been looking at tools in the 2010s, for example. There has been a first wave of interesting publishing tools that emerged there, but many of them then again faded out because the underlying technology wasn't ready to support these kind of visionary approaches. And I think now with web standards having increased and having developed further, having matured as well, what we see now is that, yeah, the more general infrastructure and protocols that the web relies on are now more compatible really with what publishing needs and wants to do. And this now leads to this wider and a very interesting range of open publishing platforms that can really work with open metadata standards, for example, that allow a really performative way of doing annotation, for example, something which wasn't really ready at a practical stage like 5 or 10 years ago. So when we look at Hypothesis, for example, this service and protocol that they are building upon, this is now really something that has matured and can work across a variety of platforms, and this is really exciting to see. Marcel, you just wanted to.
Yeah.
I just looked into my notes and I saw that I forgot like the for me, very important kind of point here. So what I think that what we got aware is like that the publishing workflows got aware, and people who just do things, write things, especially collaboratively, that they started to understand that there is source material for texts, just as we knew it in open source as in open source software. So in that sense, the writing also has its source. So I think that there is very interesting kind of convincing argument now, which kind of is not necessarily just the tool, but it's more like a convention. So the way how you will format your text. So Markdown became a very kind of powerful, and a lot of tools would rely on that. And at the same time, source materials, how you keep them. So the Git, which proved itself mostly with the GitHub as a big corporation, which kind of got bought by Microsoft, it also like it established, Git as a technology established itself as kind of the standard how to keep it. So it allows us for very easy distributive topologies, and at the same time having Markdown inside of the Git will help anyone who wants to preserve and to archive the materials. It will be so much more easier than the previous generation of technology, where it would be much harder because of the database, like the script-based kind of systems. So in that sense, I think that it moves in a nice direction, and it addresses a lot of problems we faced in last like few decades.
Mm-hmm. Janneke, did you want to add anything there?
I guess very quickly, I think what I thought was, I kind of expected this, but I think from looking at the different books that we've included in typology and kind of doing some reading around that, what I really noticed was that for most of those experimental books, what becomes clear in the relationship between researchers and publishers is that publishers tend to be involved in experimental book publishing projects much earlier than they are in a traditional kind of non-experimental book. So this means that mostly already from the start of the conception of the research, publishers are involved in one way or another. And this is also something we try to mirror within the work that we've been doing for COPIM. So we're working together with, at the moment, with 3 presses, so with OABN Press, with Mattering Press, and with Open Book Publishers to do 3 of these pilot cases, together with communities in Mexico, people from the POP, Politics of Patent projects, and with Simon Worthington from the TIB, who's got a wealth of experience already in experimental publishing. And we're trying to kind of have those conversations around what the research is and what the research will look like and what we want to do with the research, at the same time as having these publishing conversations. So I'm really interested in this and how a lot of experimental publications are merging research and publishing, and this idea of what publishing is and when we publish is something that's being questioned there, or when a publication is done, right? And that for me is something that I find really interesting in experimental publishing, and something that I see in almost all of the experimental publishing projects that I've been looking at.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that strikes me as really interesting about this work in particular is that from often my perspective as someone who tries to talk about open access to authors or researchers who are much less familiar with it, your kind of open access itself is quite radical, and you're introducing this as something to them to start getting their heads around, and to then sort of move from that to the much more experimental work where, you know, a lot of researchers are kind of building the publishing routes or the publishing methods into the research itself. It's almost as though that's well, it is a separate discipline in a sense. But I mean, Marcel's described how, in terms of the technical side of things, you can eventually you sort of move from the experimental to the more mainstream. So I was interested to think about in what ways you can take from the experimental work and apply that to non-experimental books, or whether that can work the other way. And you know, how much do you think this work that you're doing is going to, or has the potential to influence open access publishing more broadly, or to what extent it's kind of a discipline of its own, and that it's important for that reason?
I think that depends a little bit also indeed in what you say. I mean, there are specific disciplines that have taken very much to experimental forms of publishing. I think so it feels like the digital humanities, rhetorics, whole segments of digital history, etc. So there is this kind of, yes, you're right, that it becomes in some ways a kind of a separate discipline. And this is something that I'm a bit wary about, because I wouldn't want to see that happen too much, and it becomes, and I think that's partly also what we want to do. We don't want it to become something that's overly difficult, right? Or something that's only understandable for developers. And so what we're trying to do is showcase that you can do experimental publishing in different ways, and also to highlight that it doesn't only have to be technical, right? So experimental publishing can also, for me at least, involve more conceptual elements, such as rethinking what authorship is, how we do peer review, what the form and format is of the book. And for me, experimental publishing comes down to this idea of thinking through in what forms that we publish, and why we tend to always go with this kind of printed book format, right? Which isn't always the best way to communicate our research. And for me, experimental publishing questions that. It questions these kind of specific fixtures and these kind of ways of doing things. And of course, with the digital tools that we now have available, I think it does kind of push barriers, right, to kind of show what we can do. But I don't think necessarily that these have to be barriers that are very hard to push, right? They can be really small incremental things, and we know that academic publishing is incredibly conservative, so really experimentation already happens quite quickly, I think, in that sense, but also to show that it is doable to do these kind of things, and that all this software and tools are available for publishers to start adapting, even in like something what Toby was mentioning, just installing hypothesis, for example, which isn't a big thing, but it opens up and it does so much for you to try out different ways of engaging with books. So yeah, that's what I think I would say to that.
We've had a question from Philippa. Does the project look at the reader and how these books are consumed, whether they're consumed differently, whether any challenges were faced, for example? Can anyone?
I can take that one otherwise. We're not specifically looking at readers as a kind of separate, we're looking at scholars in that sense. So I think for us, it's scholars as both authors and readers. So what we're trying to do is see how we can create more interaction around open access books. So some kind of uptake. So for us, reading in this sense, we're seeing that as an active stance, in which we're trying to see how opening up books through, for example, annotation, which you can see as a form of reading, kind of enhances it. So I don't think we're specifically looking at readers in that sense as a specific group. Maybe we should look more at them as kind of moving on a little bit beyond academics as authors and readers. So maybe that is something to explore a bit more. Thanks, Philippa.
Toby or Marcel, you've got a perspective on that one?
No, just well,
I think that I can maybe take the next question. It says,
Oh yeah,
would
so
avant-garde
from
be
Eric.
a better word? Yeah, from Eric. Then experimental describe this sort of publishing aside from the marketing aspects. So I think that this is like that avant-garde has connotation of politics. So that's so I have to say, like, I'm speaking from on behalf of myself in that sense, and I think that it's half of the answer in that sense of why it's kind of hard, because I think that avant-garde should as a term, as an idiom, should stay political. So in that sense, I think that in such a setup of the like multiple universities, a lot of administration. So I think that getting this far in this kind of setup is already a great achievement. But calling it avant-garde, I think that we wouldn't be able to kind of like deliver what is expected. So in that sense, we would maybe normalize the normal, like the depoliticizing of the avant-garde. I don't know what's your stand, Eric, on that, but for me, avant-garde would be really about challenging and rethinking and intervening politically into that field. And I think that the crowd behind especially individually, because it's very hard to get fully support from your institutions when it comes to access to knowledge, when it comes to interest of like civil disobedience when it comes to access and things like that. So how do we approach that? I think that it's in academic world, it's quite high in that sense. It's also there is like a radical open access kind of initiative. So I think that there are like a lot of, and in that sense, I agree. It's a legitimate question to ask, would it fit better? But I would say again, on my own behalf, yeah, it's exciting to think of that this way. But then also, I don't think that in this particular project we would get there that far. But I would also expect that some of the people would maybe in their own other kind of identities would maybe like go there and go for the avant-garde in its full meaning.
Thanks, Marcel. Ronald says, you mentioned Hypothesis as an example of a tool to foster communities around open access books. Do you know of other examples?
Maybe I can take that question.
There's a whole table.
Yeah, exactly. I was just looking for the link here. I'm putting a link in the chat, which is from the third part of our report, because yeah, basically that's what we've been looking at in more detail with this third part of the report. So which kind of platforms, open source platforms more specifically, and yeah, the corresponding communities that are growing or existent already around these platforms that can be harnessed for open yeah, editing, writing books, and the more long form yeah, arguments in that kind of sense. So I think there's quite a plethora of niches and existing communities in these niches that already are working on this or in this field and experimenting around developing these further, adding new features, and yeah, maybe just explore this kind of table in more detail there. Marcel, did you
Maybe
want
I can
to
add also just a few things. I think that annotations in that sense are technically quite kind of hard to do. Even it's a simple thing. You just like you annotate existing text, but there are like a number of problems for that. For example, if the text is changing through time, how do you basically show that the annotation still exists, because annotations usually technically want to have like a very kind of clear and precise text fragment which is highlighted. And then because of that, it's also very hard to get with the open standard, the standard which everyone will follow. So we started with hypothesis because that's the one which others could follow. And there are a number of other annotation systems which, because of the challenge how to build it, they started to build it inside of their own authoring tools. So in that sense, yes, they allow you for quite a good kind of annotation, but at the same time, they will not allow you necessarily for using that as a component in more modular system, where that's what we are interested when we try to kind of cover the ground of the experimentation. Toby, please, if you can continue.
Toby, did you have anything more to add?
I'm just trying to point
you
to
still...
a couple. Sorry.
No, go for it.
Is it picking up? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I sent a, sorry, I don't know if you noticed, I sent the link to the CryptPad table of the annotation tool. So if anyone wants to kind of get the list, maybe it's through chat, but Toby, if you want to like add more, please.
I'm just thinking from the work that we're doing on COPIM on the pilot cases. I think the community around Jupyter Books, for example, is a very vibrant community and which has been doing amazing stuff, both on the Jupyter Notebook more general platform, which is usually focused more on the journal side of things, but the adaptation of that towards Jupyter Books, within that sphere, I think there's been, there's lots of interesting stuff happening, and how to build books with different components, like how to integrate code, how to integrate 3D models, for example, or other interactive stuff that you have on the web that can then be presented in a book format. And on the other hand, what comes to mind is the electric book community, which is doing similar things, I think, to Jupyter Books, but it's using another technical approach. It is Markdown based as well, but doesn't rely on the Jupyter stack, so to speak. But that's also quite exciting. So make sure to check these out.
And they're all linked on the CryptPad, are they? Or is it in the table of the report, or both?
I don't think I have the electric book community in there, but I can add those. Yeah.
Cool. And we'll share them as well on the book Open Access Books Network Humanities Commons site.
But also to highlight that the report is a version report, so we're planning to release new versions. So if you have things or see things that we're missing, please get in touch, or you can leave notes on pop-up, of course, if that's easier, because we do want to include more stuff in the next version, and I think we're looking at doing one more version this year, definitely. So please, if we're missing something, do let us know, because we're hoping to be as inclusive as we can.
Does anyone else have more questions for the speakers? I had another, which I was thinking about, as you've been discussing the kind of the ethical aspect of this, the idea of an ethics of care that I think Janneke mentioned, or some of the more political angles that Marcel touched on. I think all of these things kind of center around the idea of intentionality, that you want people to approach publishing in an intentional way and to be thinking about it as almost a part of their research, as well as just something that happens at the end that somebody else does for them. If you sort of already discussed this a little bit, but how does the work package help to bring people in who maybe haven't published experimentally or thought much about experimental publishing before, but are interested in having the tools, understanding what's going on and how they can begin to publish experimentally or think experimentally about their publishing? Are there ways that the work package is trying to build that in, or is that something that you hope will happen more organically as you kind of do the outreach around it and that kind of thing?
I think we're working with a selection of both academics and presses that have no experience of doing this. So we're kind of, I think we're doing a combination. We are working with some people that indeed do have that experience. And I think the more, I would say, more advanced experimental book projects take place with those people. But we're for example, we're working with this community of researchers and technologists and students in Mexico. And we're doing something fairly simple. At the same time, my cat is attacking my laptop. So sorry if things start to fall down all of a sudden. But so we're trying to kind of combine that. We're trying to also introduce both, I would say, academics and presses to these kind of, and what we're trying to do, and that's also part of the development workflow, is that we're trying to see how we can integrate these kind of experimental workflows into publishing workflows, right? Because that is the challenge that a lot of presses and publishers have, of course, set up a quite simple stop cat a simple kind of setup or standard kind of setup, and how can we kind of start to integrate that? So, and we've got some presses that do have some experience already with experimental forms of publishing, but also some that are new to it. And what we're also trying to do, these pilot cases, we're not developing them separately from each other. We're really trying to kind of have conversations along with each other and with the publishers too. And at the same time, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to do a kind of open documentation process around them. So we're blogging and kind of all the things that developments that we're engaging with, questions that come up. And we're a little bit delayed with that at the moment because it took some time to kind of get people, because we're starting these pilot projects from the start, so also with the research. But yeah, our aim is to share as much as possible issues that come up, questions that we had, etc. And we're hoping that that would also be useful alongside this tool that we're building for people that have no experience with experimental publishing, be that authors or presses, to kind of start picking it up, basically.
Mm-hmm. I've seen a couple more comments on the chat. Eric wants us all to know that Sunday is the 50th birthday of the ebook, which I was not aware of. So that's good to know. And Cesar says, I lost part of the discussion. How can I get the recording? So the recording is going to be available on our YouTube site, which I tweeted somebody earlier today. So I should be able to find that quite quickly, hopefully. I'll get the link and put that in the chat before we finish. One other question that I had was kind of a crystal ball type question. Does this work help you to think differently about what the future looks like for the monograph? Do experimental books or perhaps experimental strategies and approaches have a central role to play, and what might that look like? To any of the three of you that want to jump in with that.
Maybe you can just reiterate what I was already saying in that sense. I think that there is that tendency. So I think that every experiment here is challenging what we know in media theory in that sense. So if the experiment is like, in that sense, good, I think that it will also raise the questions. It will not resolve anything. It will just ask more and more. And through that, I think that we will have like a richer, in that sense, richer insights in that kind of a field where so many different disciplines meet. So in that sense, that's what I can say. I don't know, like no one can know if one or another kind of paradigm or like the way to think, school of thinking will prevail. I think that it probably goes from one to another. My own kind of approach here is very much based in my understanding of technology, but at the same time, I know how much I'm wrong and reduced and narrow-minded in that sense. But without being like too much humble, I know how narrow-minded are also the others coming from other disciplines. So I think that this is where we meet, and that's how we build. That's the place of production of knowledge. And if I have to say, if I have to name it at this moment, I would probably go and say like this is like a media theory, because that's the one which we can probably like keep without like deciding where we are coming from. Is it like whatever the communication? Is it like literature theory? Is it linguistics? Is it computer science? I think that all of these are there, and then maybe we can also like negotiate more in that field, and having the experiment as our kind of entry point for the future production of knowledge.
Yeah, and I like this because I think for me it does two things in that sense. So what Marcel describes, it kind of shows glimpses of the future of what different theory could look like in a way, right? But at the same time, for me, it examines what I've already outlined. I think it examines established practices and makes us question the way that we are doing things and whether that is always the most natural or the best way to do things. So for me, it's a critical practice, if anything, experimental, critical and political practice in trying to re-examine the way we do things. And that's for me, I mean, that's why I see my research as something that I do through experimental publishing, whether that is in a kind of a more theoretical way, thinking through what publishing is or can be, but also in a more practice-based way by kind of being involved with these kind of different publishing projects, be that as an author or as somebody who's supporting them, right? Because I also think in that sense, what experimental publishing also showcases is the fact that it's a really good example of showing all the people involved in publishing and how relevant they are and the kind of roles that they play beyond the author, right? Which is the one that we always seem to emphasize and highlight. And experimental publishing highlights again that you need more people to make a book come alive. And I think that's something that traditional publishing could highlight a bit more too, I guess.
Yeah, also maybe to just quickly add to that, I think it also comes back to this initial point of, or the perspective of bibliophilia, because in the way, I think with the approach to experimental publishing, we have like future development in mind, of course, but we also look at how to, or particularly in the work package at COPIM, we particularly look at how output that is created in this experimental publishing context can be preserved for later generations. Because I think both from the research that we've been doing on the typology, for example, we noticed that lots of the earlier examples were only hard to find on the web, for example, or many of them had been turned off basically, or have been rendered non-functioning. And so I think it makes sense to also widen the focus of publishing not only on the production aspect, but also on the preservation and archiving aspect, and to draw that in not as an afterthought, but to actually involve that or include that in the process of publishing itself is something that we are looking at with experimental publishing, and I think across the work packages in COPIM anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a nice note to end on, unless anyone has any last minute burning questions that they've not asked yet. No? Okay, so huge thanks to Janneke, to Marcel and to Toby for coming and speaking to us today. Please check out the links for COPIM and for the experimental work package and for COPIM's other work. And thank you very much to all of you for coming and for bringing questions and your attention. The video will be available hopefully within the next few days, and I'll tweet it out and it'll be on the OABN as well. But for today, thanks everyone very much, and goodbye.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Happy ebook birthday.
Everyone.